Welcome back to Vivid Noise, and this might just be the most self-indulgent episode I've done so far because I'm doing an episode on Sonic Adventure 1, more specifically Sonic Adventure DX. Before I get into my main talking points that I've got prepared for this video, I just want to defend my choice a little bit because nowadays you would have to actively make the choice to play this specific version of the game because it's really easy to just play the original Dreamcast version on any number of emulators, Redream, Null DC, DMule, any others that I haven't listed. Not to mention that the PC version is also very easy to mod to essentially become the Dreamcast version. Why am I playing this specific version of the game? The main reason why, the absolute number one reason why, is because the PC version crashes when you hit the Windows key, and that really annoys me. But other than that, one of the other reasons why I'm playing DX over, because I'm emulating this, obviously, but the reason why I'm emulating this one over the original is, well, as you can see, 60 frames per second, skippable cutscenes, even though, yes, you could just hit F6 in Redream and it goes a lot faster, but it's still not as fast as skipping the cutscene outright, and there's some aesthetic changes which I personally preferred. Here's the thing, I understand that the original character models, I guess, have they have a certain appeal to them. I understand it, but you probably, if you have seen my previous videos that have anything to do with Sonic, then you know that I grew up with this version. In fact, most people did. This was, I imagine, a much better selling version because it's been on more platforms, one of which was the GameCube, which while it didn't do quite as well as the PS2, not even close, it still did way better than the Dreamcast. And as a result, I just prefer the way this game looks, but it's not just nostalgia. I've actually done a little bit of, I've evaluated it a little bit closer, and I do think the more colorful visuals, really, because DX is more vibrant, it's brighter, the new textures are a lot more, not cartoony, but just brighter. And compared to the original goes for a more, like Sonic 06, before Sonic 06 happened kind of look. Like, the color palette was a little more muted. Everything tried to look a little more realistic, and it looks good for what it was trying to do, but I think this look that DX has is just more fitting. Also, the shininess on the characters, I feel like a lot of people exaggerate. They really have more of a matte sort of look to them, especially in the PC version, actually. Where they're almost completely matte the entire time. Here, they're more matte when in Ice Cap, for example. Certain lighting conditions change the way their fur looks. Well, it's not really fur, it looks more like plastic, but, I mean, it wouldn't be until, Unleashed that we got proper fur rendering, and then the frame rate just fucking tanked, so I see why they don't really do it too much. I think 06 was actually supposed to have proper fur rendering as well for Sonic. And silver was meant to actually be made of silver. If you can look up some early concept images for the game. But anyway, back to Adventure DX. I am fully aware that apparently there are some slight collision detection issues. Just some alleged problems that weren't in the original. But I haven't experienced enough of them to make the game overall worse off. I have played the original many times, and I don't know, it's just, that frame rate, man, I try to overcome it. I try and not really pay attention to the fact that it's so much lower. It's only 30, sometimes dipping even lower than that. But man, it really affects the way Sonic handles, and all the other characters as well, to the point where it's cumbersome. It's genuinely really difficult to play. Whenever I go back to DX, it's like, man, it's like you're floating. And while my priorities might be a little bit skewed sometimes when it comes to, how much I value aesthetics versus gameplay versus whatever. I mean, first of all, I just said I prefer the aesthetics of the DX version, and even still, the gameplay is better. No amount of slight collision detection jank can overwrite the better game feel overall that this version has. It's just, you can't compare it. To each their own, of course, and I can totally understand you being very much against the DX version, but hey, this is just the one that I prefer playing. Whenever I think of Sonic Adventure 1, this is what comes to mind. No amount of, you can see the inconsistency there with the pickup, for example, but I just see that as it's like a plushie version of your character. It's actually, That is something that I noticed about the early character models. I used to mess around with Blender, and I would put a ton of ambient occlusion on like some of the Dreamcast era Sonic models, and they genuinely look like plushies. Oh man, I wonder if anyone's like actually made those. I mean, I'm sure there's like plastic, 3D printed figurines of them and stuff. But let's get to the point here. Something I've noticed about Sonic Adventure 1, especially specifically when comparing it to Adventure 2, it sort of happens when I compare it to other games from around that same time as well, but it makes most sense to compare it to games of its own series, and that is, and it's probably what I'm going to label the chapter for this section of the video, Adventure 1 and that prototype feel. What I mean by that is, I've always felt that Sonic Adventure 1 and even DX, despite the higher quality character models and such, when compared to Adventure 2, has always had this very, how do I put it, this not real game kind of feel, if that makes sense. Like when I see Adventure 2, I'm like, okay, this is a polished, nice, super well animated, scripted, cinematic type game, right? With Adventure 1, it feels, I guess it's like comparing, I don't know, Mario 64 to Mario Galaxy in a way. It has a much more video gamey sort of feel. And I know for a fact that, a good chunk of what's contributing to that is the animation, the character animation. Now, I'm no Dan, a video game animation Dan, or the other Dan who does video game animations, like everyone called Dan apparently does that. But what I can say about it, without properly analyzing the animation, is that it's just, it's a lot stiffer. I mean, you can just look at it. It doesn't have that same sense of reaction as in Sonic Adventure 2, especially for Sonic's animation. The other characters, like especially Rouge, had some pretty stiff animations in Adventure 2, but when it comes to Sonic himself, it's just no comparison here. It's like the way he moves in Adventure 1 compared to Adventure 2, there's like this lean to his movements, he leans into the corners and the bounce on his head. Just all these tiny little things which overall make the animation feel just ridiculously polished in comparison, and gives Adventure 1 this very, I don't know, Lego kind of feel to it. I'm not sure, but it really is something that, when you try and put it into words, and you realize that a lot of it is just down to the animation, and that's actually what makes a game age better or worse compared to a lot of others. It's not so much the graphics themselves, it's how they are used. Because as you can see here, this model for Sonic, I imagine, is higher poly at least. He definitely looks a lot more polished compared to even the Adventure 2 battle model, but that one's just more expressive, more alive. Everything about Adventure 2 just feels more complete, if that makes sense. Just everything works together really, really well. This kind of leads me to a point which I'm sure I've made in some of my scripted videos as well, like my traditional reviews, and that is that really a game's presentation has such an impact on how, I don't know, how legitimate it feels, if that makes sense. Because sometimes the existence of a price tag and a bunch of company logos doesn't mean the game feels like a finished, actual polished product. And I'm not even talking about whether or not the game is good. A game can be really good and really fun and still feel like, just when you look at it and the way it sounds, it could still sort of have this, of course, the obvious suspect would be Mario 64. It's such an easy target because, everyone's like, oh, it's liminal space, personalized. And after playing a bunch of other N64 games and competing games from the same time, I realized why. It's just because of the presentation. Let's say Crash Bandicoot. I think Crash Bandicoot 1 came out the exact same year on what is technically inferior hardware. Like the PS1 is weaker, and yet I never got that same sort of scary feel from Crash 1 as most people do from Mario 64, including myself when I was a kid. Fortunately, I've grown out of that, but I totally understand it. And it's a couple things. One, I think it's the more expansive environments. that just sort of makes the game feel a little emptier. Like with Crash, for example, everything is very, very compact, and there's a lot of detail, and it's very dense, and it's just, it feels modern, but not modern. Like old modern, but still appealing, right? And it's not like the N64 can't do that. No, there's actually... I recently started playing the Turok games, and by started playing, I mean, like, I'll boot them up into Project 64, and then not be able to figure out what to fucking do because the games are cryptic as shit. Except for the third one, because that one's a lot more cinematic, a lot more scripted, a lot more linear. And the first one, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, only came out a year after Mario 64, and much like a Tetris Sphere that I talked about quite a while ago, which also came out just a year after Mario 64, second year into the system's lifespan, and bada boom, we got just a level of visual polish is just insane. You don't look at that and think, wow, look at this shitty old game. You think, well, wow, look at this, it's still old. You're not going to confuse it for a modern title, but it doesn't have like anything blatantly missing about it. The fog, very smart as well. The developers decided to, they set the game in like this jungle sort of environment, so the fog almost makes sense. Working to a system's limitations and trying to make something that looks good in spite of them is really the key to having something be just not... so it prevents it from becoming uncanny. And I'm not talking about almost realistic uncanny, like with, character models that are so close to being real, but not quite actually being real. No, I'm talking about not even being able to suspend your disbelief in a way that makes this fictional world feel realized. Look at, for example, look at Doom 64. On an unrelated note, yeah, I just started playing that one, and that game looks ridiculously canny, if we have to, look at it that way, as in nothing about it looks like it doesn't belong. The pre-rendered models fit in perfectly with that gritty sort of aesthetic. The lighting is really, really nice. The color palette is just the right balance, just the right mix of like being kind of dark, but also taking advantage of the N64's fancy schmancy lighting stuff. And overall, it creates a very polished presentation, which has allowed it to look just so much better compared to almost anything out at the time on that system. It looks a billion times better than Quake 1 or 2 on the respective consoles, and even to a certain extent on PC. Looks better than GoldenEye, looks better than any of the Turoks, although Turok Free impressed me quite a lot when I played it. Really, it almost looked PC Half-Life quality, 2 years after Half-Life had come out, but still, it was keeping up pretty well. Gotta admit. Judging by the games that I've used as examples so far, this might seem like the sort of issue that only really was relevant during the transition from the 5th to the 6th generation, but actually, no. I've actually noticed quite a few 7th gen games, which, at that point, graphics were pretty much real. Let's be real, most games past the 7th generation haven't really looked much better than games from the start of that generation. Maybe the very start, like 2005 and 6, that was really sort of the beginning, and they looked more like just polished PS2 games, but everything from like 2008 onwards... again, it depends on the genre, it depends on what they're trying to depict, but I mean, look at the fucking Yakuza games, like, holy shit, even the PS2 ones look insane. Oh, and speaking of which, I've been watching, this YouTuber, Frockenok. He does Sonic stuff, but he also does a lot of, like, Japanese games. Sonic is Japanese. No, I mean, overtly Japanese stuff, like Final Fantasy and Yakuza, and, yeah, he's been playing through, the new Yakuza one. What was it? Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. Haven't played the game myself, have no interest in playing it, but I've been, experiencing it vicariously through his playthrough. That game is fucking crazy. It can, like, take itself super seriously one moment, and then be like, and then come up with this parody of Uber Eats, but it's Crazy Taxi. It's like Crazy Eats. It's just like, yeah, we get it, Sega. You own Crazy Taxi. Can you actually make a game out of that? Anyway, so like, if I had to pick a game that I've noticed has that sort of Mario 64 trademark kind of look, despite it being, decades newer. Serious Sam Free, that game, wow. I get that it's made, by Crow Team. It's not being made by some massive studio, even though at that point they were significantly bigger than they were back in their early days. But it somehow looks less put together. Yeah, it looks less put together than Serious Sam 1 or 2. Oh, and especially Next Encounter, the Xbox port, Serious Sam 2. When I said 1 or 2, I meant like Serious Sam First Encounter and Second Encounter. It's a little bit confusing, but I think I know why it looks that way. Well, a couple reasons. Some are related to what the product ended up being, and others are related to its development. Because if you've ever watched like a Frame Rater video, you'll probably know this, and that's Doom. There it is. Because Serious Sam Free was supposed to be Doom. It was actually going to end up being Doom 2016, but before 2016. It was just going to be Doom 4. And then it didn't happen. Then they wanted to make it just a generic military shooter. Then that didn't happen. And then we finally got Serious Sam Free. And I think that's why that game just looks so bizarre. Because it's like you're taking this character who has this very wacky world and making it not as wacky, but still having these exaggerated and really gruesome character models, and just the whole thing, the lighting, the environments. When I look at it, I don't see a complete game. Despite their age, I do see a complete game in the significantly older Serious Sam games. Despite their lower budgets and limited technology, those games look fine. But Serious Sam Free is like, it looks like a fucking stock Unity thing, like Unity game. I know it's not running on Unity, but still. Serious Sam 4 seems to have sort of recovered in that sense. I mean, it looks better because it's 9 years newer, and there was Siberian Mayhem and all that stuff, so you wouldn't really expect it to not look that much better. But you'd be surprised, weirder things have happened. But what I'm trying to say here is that this sort of uncanniness in the visuals isn't limited to just games with quote-unquote shady graphics. No, they can have good graphics, if you consider Serious Sam Free to have good graphics, and yet it can still look all disheveled and just kind of not right. And back to Sonic Adventure 1, I'm not saying it looks like that. No, I think Sonic Adventure 1 looks more polished, but compared to Adventure 2, compared to Heroes, compared to competing games, compared to Sunshine, holy shit. I may not be the biggest Mario guy. I've never even played Sunshine past the first 2 missions. But man, that game looks insane. That game is never going to look bad. You don't even have to increase the resolution. It still looks good even at 480. Well, it helps. But still, it's insane. Just how, it's vibrant. It's smooth. Well, it's not. It's 30 FPS, but it's a really well animated 30 FPS. The post-processing is very tastefully done. Everything about it, it looks incredible. I almost think it looks better than the Galaxy games in a way, just because of how much snappier and more aggressively animated, I guess, Mario is. He feels a little floatier, a little softer in Galaxy, which makes sense because of the level design. You don't want to have him be too quick, because then you just get all mad space, right? If we were to actually use Mario as an example of what I'm talking about right now, it's actually this whole, lack of polish or higher level of polish sort of relationship. You can find this phenomenon even on the very console that housed Mario 64, the Liminal Space game. And that would be his spin-offs, like Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, Mario Kart especially. Really, I mean, Mario Kart is not the most polished looking racer on the N64, but it still feels just so much more complete. It makes sense that would be the case, considering that with Mario 64 they were essentially pioneering this new genre, whereas with Mario Kart 64 they were just taking what they already had and just giving it polygons and stuff. And so they had a lot more time to iron out the visual quirks compared to having to actually figure out the gameplay, because the gameplay was figured out. What is there to figure out about drive around, fuck your opponent over with some items, and then throw the controller at the TV, and then obviously the TV breaks because the N64 controllers are pitchforks which stab into everything. Duh. But there's also the sports games, like Mario Tennis really impressed me. It wasn't even made by Nintendo themselves, it was made by Camelot. third-party studio, and it just looks really polished. The animation quality is great, the effects are great. I love the sort of replays that they have. Just overall a very, I guess you call it an un-N64 looking game. It just looks really good. I'm not really too into the gameplay itself, but hey, the presentation is great. Also, the Mario Party games. I don't really care for Mario Party, but they're bright and they're loud, they're exuberant, they're eccentric, and they just create a really great feel-good sort of vibe. Or Paper Mario. Man, that game has not aged a second since it left the production line. Seriously, that paper art style was a perfect choice, absolutely genius choice for the N64's hardware, because most games from that time, no matter what they were on, looked like they were made of cardboard anyway. So fucking genius. Make the game out of paper and cardboard. And it works so damn well. In fact, I think it's my favorite looking of the Paper Mario games. Though I'm always going to have a little bit of nostalgia for Super Paper Mario. Never played it because I never owned a Wii, but I watched a lot of videos about it, and I always thought it was really cool because it was real time, and you could switch from 2D to 3D and stuff. And now that Dolphin's pointer emulation has gotten a hell of a lot better, I might actually be able to play it for once. It's still got like RPG elements, so that might kind of hold it back for me, but I guess it's better than the newer ones. I don't know, it's really interesting because Mario is like the kind of franchise where like everything he does is great, typically. But apparently from what I've gathered, sort of dwelling on the internet, the newer Paper Mario games are, I guess, not good. I'm sure they're still really good games, but I've seen all these videos like the cynical reality of modern Paper Mario or something like that. Apparently the newer ones aren't very good. Which, it's Mario, so I'm like, how is that possible? But to be fair, it's not, first of all, it's not an in-house franchise. It's not being made by Nintendo. It's being made by Intelligent Design, who, they're not Nintendo, and so I imagined that Nintendo's overall level of control over the quality isn't quite as strict as it would be, though it's still Nintendo we're talking about, so I'm sure that they oversee pretty much every single decision that is made. They don't just let them run loose, because they're very protective of their IPs, don't you know? That's not to say that a good game can't be made in that way. I think Treyarch, they kind of found themselves, through the Call of Duty franchise, and they were able to make something really great, like Black Ops 1 and 2, or going back to Doom 64, that game wasn't made by id, it was made by Midway. Id oversaw a lot of the decisions that were made for that game, but ultimately it was Midway. Or, speaking of Doom, Plutonia as well. That was made by like 2 people in 4 months, and I think they simply requested them to make it, and they gave them a really strict deadline, and ended up really good. Apparently much better than TNT Evolution. I haven't really played either that much, but that's just, I've been binge watching Big Mac Davis's Let's Plays, and from what I can tell, Plutonia is much better overall in terms of quality. And sticking to the theme of Sonic, I mean, come on, like Sumo Digital, those guys made like 2 of Sonic's highest rated games before Frontiers. Because Frontiers got really good reviews, but before that, some of his highest rated games were Sonic All-Stars 1 and 2, Transformed. That game had like a 10 out of 10 on Steam at some point, I think. It might still have it. And rightfully so, it's a fucking amazing game, and guess what? It wasn't made by Sonic Team, even though I'm like the only person left who doesn't think that Sonic Team has like lost their way. Well, here's the thing, that's kind of impossible for it to happen, because it's a bunch of different people. The Sonic Team we have now is not the same Sonic Team who made Adventure 2. Not even close. Like, none of the employees are the same other than maybe Iizuka. That's just kind of how it works. So you can't really have a bunch of people losing sight of what they're doing when it's different people. The team itself, if you look at it as an entity, sure, I guess that makes sense. But even then, Frontiers was definitely a step in the right direction, and while I really enjoyed Superstars after playing it, and it was made by a third party, it wasn't made by Sonic Team, some people don't seem to be quite as fond of it. And I'm not just going to chalk that up to, well, it's a recent Sonic release. Well, yeah, so was Frontiers, and that got really good reviews, and that's not how it works. But I don't know, I liked it. I thought the level design was very enjoyable. The animation for the characters was amazing. I've never seen Sonic this fluidly animated in 2D before, other than sprite work, you know, like in Mania and stuff. And well, I guess no, Knuckles Chaotix, it may be vibrant, but it's not that fluid. Actually, the animation is a little bit lower fidelity. Although the boss animation in Superstars is, honestly, it's ridiculously amateurish. Like, I don't even know how the hell it passed. Seriously, it looks so stiff and weird. It's just like, come on, you're a 9th gen game being published by a AAA, not being developed by one. I don't think the guys who made it were a AAA studio, but, you know, Sega's publishing it, not fucking, like, who's a small publisher. Well, there you go. I don't even know who they are. So, you know, that's what I'm trying to say. I really expect better in terms of the boss animation, even though I have made this point several times in many of my previous videos about how I don't really care for boss fights, but if you're gonna have them, like, come on, have them animate a little bit better. You know, Sonic Unleashed had amazing animation. To be fair, Sonic Unleashed was also a much bigger budget project and was apparently gonna be like the last Sonic game ever made, because, you know, 06 kind of it did a goof. But anyway, back to Superstars. Yeah, that game was really enjoyable. I found the physics were, well, they weren't quite Mania, but they never really mattered to me. I'm not gonna lie, I've never really understood Sonic fans' obsession with, like, proper ball physics. As long as they work in tandem with the level design, then it should be okay no matter what they are. It's kind of arbitrary whether or not they're accurate to real life ball physics. It can be satisfying though to, you know, build up a bunch of speed and stuff, but whatever, I didn't really pay attention to that. The level design was, you know, I already said it was very it was straightforward, a decent amount of alternate pathways. It wasn't anything. Again, it's not Mania. It's not Mania 2. Mania ultimately, what the fuck am I trying to do here? I'm trying to, like, skip past yeah, I'm trying to spin dash jump over the barrier. I eventually do it though. But anyway, yeah, so Mania is still ultimately better. That game is aged like a good cheese, you know what I mean? Like wine. Like, it's just it'll never age because pixel art, because of incredibly solid design, T-Lopes' music, and T-Lopes did do most of the music for Superstars as well. They brought in a couple new guys to do music too, and it's really good. It's just not very consistent. Like the second act, I think it was the second or third act of Speed Jungle, it just has this random Unreal Tournament drum and bass thing going on, which is fucking amazing. I love that song so much, with that freaking A flat major 7 thing going on. And then like this strange half step movement from F to E, and it's great. You know, it's a little bit jazzy, but it's just a very jungle kind of. Oh my god, it's jungle music for the jungle level. That's actually fucking genius, actually. But it is very different compared to the previous song, which was all T-Lopes, you know, and his T-Lopes-ness. I don't know what genre of music T-Lopes even makes, but it's great, right? It's just a super bombastic, super high-energy kind of sound. So a little more consistency in the OST would have been appreciated, but it's not like it was bad. Like, the music was really good, other than, like, I think some of the boss songs, which are apparently, like, super repetitive. Honestly, I kind of had the game audio turned down pretty low and had some noise in the background, like some, you know, YouTubers and stuff. That's usually what I do. Like, I'll have the game audio playing for the first few levels, and then I'll turn it down, because I do want to appreciate the sound design and most of the music, and then I'll just kind of, yeah, okay, I get it. I want to listen to, you know, some random person talk about other video games in the background while I'm playing a video game. That's probably not good for my attention span, but anyway. Before I move on to my second point that I want to talk about, that being the difference in presentation that I've noticed, at least from that early era of console games transitioning to PC and vice versa, or no, primarily PC games transitioning to consoles, from, like, you know, mainly the late 90s. I've basically become a mini LGR at this point. It's just everything's late 90s, but I'm sorry, but that's just a really interesting time period for me. Before I talk about that, I want to bring up something that surprisingly has gone pretty neglected online, and that is Mega Man 9 and 10 and subsequently 11's impact. So, okay, basically a while ago I saw a video by, I think it was Digital Foundry, who talked about I know, it's just, that's how you title a video. They titled the video, it was like Mega Man 11 hyphen Mega Man Sonic Mania moment. But that got me thinking, actually no, Sonic Mania was Sonic's Mega Man 9 and 10, especially 9. That was the better game if you ask me. It was Sonic's Mega Man 9 moment, and Superstars is Sonic's Mega Man 11 moment, if you really think about it. You know, because one game is a straight up throwback to that sort of classic era when everything was sprite based, and it was the better game, just like how 9 is better, if you ask me, than 11. Although not by much. 11 is a very, very good game, and how Mania is better than Superstars, although still I like Superstars a lot. Yeah, it's that parallel, and the same way that 11 was this sort of modernization of that classic formula with new visuals and such and new additions, and you know, go figure, Superstars was exactly that. It was essentially the real Sonic 4, you know, the 50th real Sonic 4. I mean, we got like Sonic Advance and Sonic Mania and, well, a bunch of Sonic fan games that everyone's like, it's the real Sonic 4. Well, I guess in a way, if you're talking about official games, Superstars would be the closest one to a real Sonic 4. Kind of, because it updates the visuals, introduces a new character. You know, you can play as Amy now, just like how you could in Sonic Advance. But yeah, it just sort of feels like that natural progression, and I don't think that Mega Man got enough credit for that. I'm not saying that they specifically used Mega Man 9 and 11 respectively as inspiration for those games, but in the grander landscape of video games, I imagine they played some part. Yeah, those games are many, many years apart. For example, when was Mega Man 9? It was like 2008? Sonic Mania was 2017, so that was 9 years. But even then, I find similarities. I like to find the similarities there, and overall, I feel like not enough people talk about Mega Man 9. That was a really, really solid game. It was... I don't think it went too far back. Some people think that it stripped itself a little bit too much of some of the newer additions to Mega Man, quote-unquote newer. I'm talking about the slide and charge shot, but it was still incredibly fun. I think if anything, it was kind of a flex on the developer's part to show that, yeah, we can make a really solid platformer with even fewer abilities, you know, because it's easy to just have your character be able to do a lot of things, and that's fun. Like imagine Mario 64 without Mario's insane moveset. It just wouldn't be as fun. Imagine Sonic Adventure here without the spin dash. Oh my god, it wouldn't even... It would still be like, if they designed the levels around it, it would still be okay, but that's what makes this game, and that's what makes it so different compared to Adventure 2. And going back to that game for just a little bit, I think I realized that the lack of the spammable spin dash is what might have contributed to that more polished feel, because a large part of Adventure 1 and its sort of, again, prototypey sort of-ness to it is the fact that you could just break it in half by spin dash jumping everywhere. You can see me do it in a couple parts in this video. And when they removed that in Adventure 2, it did sort of allow it to take itself a little more seriously, if that makes sense. Because there's two kinds of ways that games take themselves seriously, I find. There's ones that take themselves seriously plot-wise, where it's like, oh, the stakes are super high and all the characters, you know, they don't crack any jokes. And then there's taking yourself seriously from a gameplay standpoint. And that's the thing, I think Adventure 2 definitely takes itself more seriously, not just in terms of the plot, but also the gameplay. It doesn't want you, you know, goofing off quite as much, although you can still do that if you know what you're doing with the controls. But here, it's much more experimental. Like, it's a playground. Like, every level in Adventure 1 is a playground, and it's what gives it a very different feel, and it's still incredibly fun. I love both of these games. I do think Adventure 2 is, like, better, but I love Adventure 1 a ton. And I think it's finally time to move on to my next talking point, that being, I've been sort of observing this interesting trend amongst games that were initially exclusive to PC, at least for a year, and then they were ported to console, especially first-person shooters. I talk about these two games a lot, but, well, they were kind of a big deal back then, so of course I'm going to talk about them. Quake Free and Unreal Tournament. I'm not sure if you're aware, but both games have received Dreamcast and PS2 ports. Well, sort of. Like, Quake Free got a PS2 port that was more of a, like, PS2 reimagining kind of It was like Quake Free Revolution with a bunch of extra stuff, but it's pretty much just a port. And something I noticed when trying them out and also looking up videos of them, because yes, I actually have played Quake Free Revolution like myself. It's because, yeah, you can just play the PC version, and I have played the PC version on this channel, but I just wanted to see what the PSU version was like. And also, same thing with Unreal Tournament. And something I noticed is that the presentation is super different. I don't just mean the graphics. In fact, the graphics carried over pretty well, all things considered. In fact, I'm especially impressed by Quake Free Revolution because it runs a native widescreen and 60 frames per second. God damn. But of course, no keyboard and mouse support, which the Dreamcast version got right. What the hell? So did both ports of Unreal Tournament, which is why if you're, I guess back then, if you were, hold on, here's the funny thing though. Who are these games for, if you really think about it? Because if you're into keyboard and mouse, well, you're just gonna have a PC anyway, and you're just gonna want to play the PC shooters. If you're more into consoles, you're not gonna mind using a controller, or you're just gonna want to play a game that's tailor-made for the controller, really. Where the hitboxes are more calibrated for that, the level design is different, you know, like very console shooters, for example, Turok and GoldenEye. And Halo, I mean, you know, the console shooter revolution. Still, it's nice that you get the option, though, to use those better control methods. But what I really wanted to talk about was the change in menus. It's very interesting to me that they decided to give every single version of those games completely different interfaces. HUDs, main menus, options, all sorts of stuff. Especially, I really love Quake Free's Dreamcast transitions. It has these really cool things where they like sort of apply this overlay of the logo on top of the game as it's running, as it transitions from like level to level and stuff, and like in the loading screens. It looks really cool. It also has a totally custom soundtrack, which is almost better than the original soundtrack. It's got a lot more melody to it. It's much lighter. It's not so much industrial metal. It's more, you'll see comments comparing it to Linkin Park, and yeah, it's a little bit Linkin Parky, honestly. I mean, you got those harmonics and stuff. You know what else sounds a lot like Linkin Park? I think it was track 4 or track 7 from Nitro Family, like one of the few games to actually use the Sirius engine that isn't Serious Sam. That shit goes so hard when you put it underneath Somewhere I Belong. Just pitch it down a half step, I think, from B to B flat, and it, like, Chester's vocals go on top of that like, you know, peanut butter and jelly. It's insane how well you obviously got to speed it up a little bit because the tempo of the track's a little different, but otherwise, yeah, it sounds great. I should maybe I'll post that remix because I've actually made it as like a little mashup thing on my other computer, but I don't know, I'm probably not going to post it, though. It's not really the kind of channel where I upload the source stuff, or maybe I will, who knows. But yeah, I'm just sort of curious as to why it even happened, why they actually went out of their way to design these new menus, because it's not as if, maybe with Unreal, but for Quake especially, the original Quake Free menu is very navigatable with just a keyboard, and therefore it would also be navigatable with a controller. The Unreal menu, yeah, I totally get why they changed it, because it was very, like, Windows, well, it looked like a window, you know, in Windows. Oh wow, that's probably why they call it that. No, that's what I mean. It had like the drop downs and stuff. It looked like you were just navigating a regular application you would open in your OS, as opposed to a video game menu, quote unquote. And I totally get why they changed it, but for Quake, it's like, really? Even some of its earlier stuff was already very, you know, keyboard, like it was very up, down, left, right sort of friendly. It didn't really need a mouse. You don't need a mouse to navigate Doom's menus, or Quake's menus for that matter, any of the prior Quakes, or even Quake Free. So why they changed it, I don't know. It's sort of, it's a study of maybe the market, like maybe they analyze how other games on that system and just console games in general, how they looked, and made the executive decision that, oh, well, console people, as if they're like a different race of humans. The console people, they need prettier looking menus, otherwise they won't play the game. It's like, yeah, I get updating it for the sake of functionality, but the aesthetics is just sort of, you know, so much almost wasted effort, really. And again, for Unreal, specifically Unreal Tournament, the Dreamcast version had totally different menus to the PlayStation 1. Even though they're both consoles, they could have just taken the PS2 menus and just slapped the Dreamcast buttons on top, so actually just the Xbox buttons, they're pretty much the same. But no, they went in and made totally different ones. Again. Which is just, like, why? I imagine it was made by a different studio, but really, could they not have shared assets like that? Like, were they bound legally to make their own? It's just sort of weird. I kind of get why they did it for Quake 3. Well, I don't get it because it had much simpler menus to begin with, but I do get why they changed them for Quake 3 Revolution, because they were trying to sort of rebrand the game in a way. They were trying to make it all different, like it was its own thing. So I get why they changed the menus there. Even though I still ultimately think the game looked best interface-wise on Dreamcast, it's just so damn clean. And, you know, the mouse and keyboard support makes it actually a very playable version of the game, but, you know, obviously you just play the PC version. This sort of movement hasn't completely died off, too, unlike a lot of things from the late 90s. I've noticed that games that are still very PC-specific have retained that aspect of their conversions. Like, when they go to a different system, they will be quite heavily altered for the sake of functionality. For example, Minecraft and Terraria, their interfaces are quite different compared to how they are on PC. The aesthetics of the interface is pretty much the same. You know, I think the days of having the color palettes and the design of the actual menu totally change between systems, I think that's gone. Unfortunately, I hope it comes back at some point, because it is really cool to see these different takes on the same interface. But the actual look of the menus is the same now. But the functionality, the way they're organized and stuff, that is different because, well, obviously, you got to use a controller and not a keyboard. And so that's still around more out of necessity than anything else. Come to think of it, some simulation racers also undergo this procedure. Like in 2014, I think it was, Assetto Corsa, which was a very, you know, PC hardcore type sim racer, it actually came to console, like, you know, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and again, they redesigned the menus, even though the original menus were still, I imagine them being sort of usable with a controller. They weren't too mouse specific, like a mouse driven. You could use a mouse, but yeah, they went ahead and gave them this complete makeover with just a totally different UI. Again, the sort of visual language stayed the same. You know, you got that red color palette and stuff. But again, it's just interesting that they went and changed it to, even to the extent that it almost wasn't even necessary in certain instances. It's just, it's really cool that there are still cases of this sort of change between platforms happening, even though nowadays, like, the difference between a console and a PC game is just a matter of it being available on those platforms. But if it's available on multiple platforms, it's going to be the exact same game. And I understand that used to be the case mainly due to hardware restraints, but even in like the 6th generation, when, you know, console hardware got a hell of a lot better, you'd still get those differences. You know, my personally most relevant example would be, you know, like Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, how the PS2 version was made by Black Box and EA Seattle made the other ones. Even though I could totally see the PS2 version running on the rest of the platforms. In fact, the PS2 was the weakest of all of those systems. The GameCube, Xbox, and PC were all more powerful, and yet the PS2 version actually ended up being the best one, which almost makes me kind of mad that I grew up with the PC one, because I'm always going to have that nostalgia for the PC version, even though the PS2 version is just objectively better in every single way. Like, I don't think there's a single aspect in which the PC version is better, other than maybe the car models. And yeah, if you value that over the game, I mean, well, to be fair, I sometimes value that, but in this case, no, it's overwhelmingly better than the rest of the versions. The first logical explanation would probably just be, you know, legal reasons. Like, they hired this particular studio to do this version, it would just be cheaper to get this other one, or maybe they don't have the rights to this particular engine. Yeah, maybe like this studio was already familiar with this engine, so it'd be cheaper to get them compared to this other one that works with this. All sorts of bullshit, right? And that's why back then a lot of games that ended up on different platforms, even if technically they could have been the same, they weren't, right? Or like, let's say Forsaken 64 versus Forsaken PS1. I'm sure the N64 could have run the same game as Forsaken PS1 and PC, but No, they made their own, and I'm kind of glad they did because it was a very good version. I might even cover it on this channel because surprisingly enough, and yes, I know the Forsaken Remaster has the levels anyway, but it's different when you're playing them in the proper order as they were originally made for that version. But the good news is that Forsaken on N64 is like the only game where if you map mouse movements to the analog stick in Project 64, it actually handles perfectly. Like, it just plays like the PC version. I'm not even kidding. There's no dead zone, there's no input lag, there's none of that jank that you typically get when you try to map your mouse to an analog stick like that or a D-pad. It feels just perfect, and it might just be because of the way the game interpolates your movements anyway, which in a way is kind of what annoys me about the PC version, because it doesn't feel as precise as it could have been. But on console, I gotta admit that was very surprising to me. It's like I just play it like second nature. I don't have to adjust, I don't have to sort of remember, oh, it's a little more sensitive when you go in this direction. No, none of that. It's just perfect. So I might cover it on this channel. I understand that there probably are other instances when the hardware in question genuinely restricts what the game can be on different platforms, so that's why it's, actually just remade from scratch and often ends up being better, which in a strange way, now in a world with the Nintendo Switch, which hasn't seen, an improvement in hardware in 7 years, I almost feel like we should go back to that. I mean, unless Nintendo releases a major hardware buff for like a new release of the Switch, which might not be the best idea because that would make every Switch now obsolete. I mean, to be fair, people would just be forced to buy a new one, and that would just be more ka-ching. But maybe making cut down sort of, not necessarily simpler, but more optimized versions of certain games specifically for Switch might be a good idea, because there's just so many. For every, Witcher and stuff like that, for every occasionally impressive Switch port, there's also like a bunch of really, really bad ones. So, it's a give and take in a way. But what's really strange about the situation is that the gap between the level of hardware available in the PS5 and the Xbox Series X and all that, the current 9th gen consoles and the Switch, even though the gap is absolutely massive to the point where a lot of games just straight up don't come to Switch or are just butchered, at the same time, the hardware in the Switch is still more than enough to pull off the kind of games that we would be getting anyway. Really, because the sort of limitations we used to have as far as what we could do with the actual gameplay fizzled away during the 7th generation, really. Maybe for the most part, even the 6th generation. Now it's just a matter of how good does the game look. And yes, I'm sure there's certain systems, especially when it comes to AI and things that happen procedurally, that are only possible with the power of the PlayStation 5 and such, especially for talking about open world games with procedural generation. I'm still absolutely amazed that 4J Studios were able to get Minecraft running at a respectable frame rate. I think it runs at 60 FPS on the Xbox 360. That thing came out in 2005. I still can't get over that fact, but the fact that they got Minecraft running as well as they did with, few compromises, so to speak, I'm still amazed by that, really. I actually recently emulated that version specifically just to bask, just to be like, wow, they did that. You could just play the PC version, which is just so much better, but still, it's incredible. Just think about it for a second. A CPU from 2005, when there are still some newer CPUs that when you turn the settings up high enough, even they can fall to their knees when playing that game. And yes, I missed the snake on that rotation because I find that when I try to rush, I always end up dying here, so I just waited. There you go. Yeah, it's a lot safer this way. I find that if I had to pinpoint the exact kind of game the Switch is at its peak wit, it would have to be two types. Indie games, preferably ones with pixel art visuals, and last gen games, or especially like last gen games. So I'm talking like the 7th generation. A couple years ago, there was this really good port of a race driver. No, it's not a race driver grid anymore. It's just Grid Autosport, which was like, it was a fairly decent racing game for PC, but on Switch, compared to a lot of other stuff that's on Switch, it's insanely good. Like, it's a fucking game changer, you know, and that thing came out 2 generations ago. It was absolutely pushing what the 360 could do, and it looked great on PC, but, you know, it's right at home from a graphical standpoint, like technologically, on the Switch. I feel like it's just, like, right up on the edge of what the Switch can do really, really well, and obviously there's stuff like, you know, Sonic Mania, Shovel Knight, even though they don't use pixel art, you know, Mega Man 11, Sonic Superstars, also Mario Wonder, those kind of games, like simple 2D platformers, that is just peak Switch. It's not being overworked, it's doing exactly what it can do really well, and it just works, right? I really, really hate the phrase, wow, this game pushes the system to its limits. When I hear that a game pushes a system to its limits, I hear this game maybe looks kind of pretty, but runs like ass and isn't very enjoyable overall. Really? You don't want a system to be pushed to its limits. That's what causes frame rate drops. Generally, you want to be right on that edge before it starts to be pushed. So you want it to be at around 85% or so, but never more than that. That's when problems start to happen when you go beyond. Even below that. That's the really weird thing about CPU. Sometimes, like, my CPU will be at, like, what, 20% utilization, and yet a certain emulator I'm running will still chug, and I'm like, excuse me, where's the rest of it? Where's the other 80%? But then I realize, well, sometimes it's just internal, like it's just an issue within the, oh, watch this. And and I couldn't be bothered to come up with a clever way to edit that out, because I actually edited out a ton of deaths and restarts in this, not as many as my Sonic Adventure 2 Let's Play, but still quite a few. But yeah, that was just, I just did that. Yeah, but anyway, I do genuinely believe it is very understated just how important it is to make sure that the platform that you're making your game for is comfortable with that platform. That's how you get the best games. Like, notice how the best games, especially for console, because those are the most limited, because with PC you can always just make it better, but for consoles, the best games are the ones that don't really push the system all that hard, the ones that run relatively well, that are simple generally, but are satisfying in their design, might have pulled off a couple of interesting graphical tricks, but don't rely on it too much. Like, I can't imagine ever playing, like, Perfect Dark again, you know, the original N64 version of Perfect Dark. Like, Jesus Christ. What's it at, like 15 FPS or something? Yeah, it looks pretty good for N64, but it still doesn't look very good today. So was it worth it? Wouldn't it make way more sense to make a game that looks just kind of on par with the rest, rather than, you know, trying to push? Also, this is the fastest I've ever solved this puzzle. Nice. Yeah, I don't know how I did that. But yeah, wouldn't it be better to make something that's just sort of, you know, okay visually, but will still hold up in terms of its fluidity and art direction as well? I mean, it's kind of hard to make something look realistic when you have limited visuals, because realism kind of it demands high fidelity graphics, right? That's just kind of how it works. You can get away with a lot less with stylization. Why do you think Jet Set Radio, I've never actually played Jet Set Radio, but from what I can tell, that game just holds up insanely well, just from its presentation. Like, the color palette, the models, the game seems to run pretty well. It's really not pushing the Dreamcast in the slightest, and it's better for it. Or, I don't know, Crazy Taxi, that too, or even the original Sonic Adventure 1, although it doesn't run quite as well as Adventure 2. Yeah, Adventure 2 does actually run at 60 FPS, even on Dreamcast. Although I think they might have sacrificed a little bit of fidelity on the models, because even though the models are more expressive, I swear they're just a little bit pointier. But that kind of works with Sonic's design, so, you know, it's actually better in that way. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to try and make, like, a system pusher, just do another Crysis, right? Just do it for PC, because that system can always be improved later, right? See, Crysis was, while I'm not the biggest fan of it as a game, I think it was a very smart move, because now you can run the game on, you know, mid-range hardware pretty damn well at the highest settings, no problem. And it really benefits. You can really see what the developers were going for if, you know, money was no object for anyone back then. Because really, when the game came out, it was like, dude, I get like 10 FPS on Crysis. Oh man, I get like 9 FPS. You're so rich. You know, it was just like this bragging right. Whereas now it's just, oh wow, it's actually a really fucking good looking game with some solid gameplay behind it as well. Although, again, I would much rather play a little more linear of a game. I really need to play Fear. That game looks insane, and also that game's held up really well, I might add, because its environments are much more, it helps that its environments are more cramped, because that, you know, if there's one thing that computers are really good at rendering, it's not a lot, if that makes sense, just like smaller environments. So considering that like 90% of Fear is just office complexes and just these tiny little box corridors and stuff, it actually still looks pretty damn well, because there's only so much you can improve when it comes to rendering a wall, right? And the lighting is still really good. It's got all these, like, you know, ripple effects and stuff like that when, like, you're using the bullet time mode. Yeah, I really need to play it sometime. There's also something to be said about those, like, programming magic type games, stuff like Serious Sam, where you have a lot of stuff going on that's like technically sort of impressive, but you're not really pushing anything too hard. I still cannot believe that a game like Serious Sam, with its like thousands of enemies on screen, okay, not thousands, but hundreds, was able to run on the kind of processors and the kind of GPUs they had back in 2001. It's just kind of insane. And well, that game wasn't known for being some, you know, oh man, can it run this game? No, it just ran, from what I've, you know, gathered on the internet. I was just born that year, so I couldn't really confirm that myself, unless I built a period correct PC right now, but I'd rather do a million things than track down old PC parts, so, you know. But you get the idea. That, I think, has way more merit, actually, than like a system pusher that's just like intense for the sake of it. Although, obviously, it hasn't held up quite as well as it would have if they went a little crazier, but well, you gotta remember that was a small studio in Croatia. I don't think they really could have done that much more to begin with, but still, it was a very impressive game, and it's still very fun. I should do a Vivid Noise episode on maybe the first and second encounter, like maybe like 2 levels from the first, 2 levels from the second. Something like that, that would be pretty cool. And now that I'm talking about hardware in this way, come to think of it, maybe the fact that really none of Sonic's games on the GameCube, really during the 6th generation, were all that impressive. I mean, not a single one of them stacks up to Mario Sunshine, for example, or even to Wind Waker, honestly. Now, it's kind of unfair because the first two, Adventure 1 and 2, were really Dreamcast games, which I've always considered more of a 5th gen system that just was more powerful. It was a 6th gen console in a 5th gen world. It was kind of strange, but even with like Heroes and Shadow, those games also didn't really, they looked really good if you ask me aesthetically. Yes, even Shadow, I like the way that game looks, but if you look at like the models and the lighting, overall, yeah, you got many other games beating them easily, especially considering they were also on the Xbox. And if you compare like Shadow the Hedgehog to Doom Free, no contest, man. But well, one's like a, you know, 3D platformer that was sort of rushed, and the other was a shooter made that was like in development for I don't even know how many years. That was all, it was meant to be like a tech showcase, but still. But in a way, I feel like the fact that none of these games were really all that impressive might have been a blessing in disguise, because we really did get that great performance. Again, Mario Sunshine was gorgeous, but it only ran at 30. I'm not sure about Wind Waker. I imagine it could have run at 60, but considering that not many people bring it up, maybe it didn't. I mean, it's not like 60 FPS would really benefit a game like Zelda. It's not like super twitchy or, you know, like reflex oriented or anything. But still, it would have been nice. Maybe it does run at 60. I'm not sure. I haven't played it. Although I'm certain that Twilight Princess doesn't run at 60, though, on GameCube. I just don't see that happening. A game that looks that good. And it really does look very good. But yeah, when it comes to the Sonic, you know, 6th generation quintilogy, I think we almost took it for granted, you know, how well they performed, despite their sort of last gen kind of visuals, really. I mean, Heroes is still really, really pretty, you know, with its color palettes and stuff, and Shadow did have some pretty cool post-processing, but still nothing compared to a lot of other games from that time. And again, it's just that performance. I think even if it wasn't necessarily intentional on the developer's part, it's a consequence that I feel was, for the most part, worth it. You know, like, imagine if, like, Heroes had way higher poly character models, but chugged, right? I mean, the PS2 version chugs anyway, but it's PS2. What do you expect? The only really good PS2 games are the ones that are exclusive. Typically, the PS2 version of a multi-platform game will be the weakest version, but there are some very strong exclusives. That poor performance wasn't necessarily the PS2's fault all of the time. It was the weakest system, but when in the right hands, it can do some really great things. And sometimes it really is just a matter of who's working on it. Look at the 7th generation, the PS3 and Xbox 360. The PS3, I believe, was more powerful, but oftentimes those versions of the games would just not run as well because, well, the infamously complicated architecture, and people they couldn't be bothered to really work with it. I mean, didn't like Valve call it like a waste of time or something like that? And yeah, really the only consistently great releases again for PS3 were the exclusives. Again, like, let's say racing games, you got MotorStorm, you got Gran Turismo, right? But for the most part, if you're talking about like games that were on multiple platforms, like the Dirt games, for example, or the F1 games, you get the 360 version on console, or you get the PC version. Generally, that would be the best one. And then, funnily enough, the 8th generation saw a massive turnaround in favor of Sony, because not only was the PS4 just a better system anyway, but it got way better support. I believe that was more due to the fact that Microsoft just made some really, really fucking stupid decisions at that point. Not even so much to do with the console itself, but just how it worked. But yeah, it's just, hey, Sony won for that one, and I think they're still winning in this generation as well, though it doesn't really matter anymore because Nintendo were just kind of like, yo, we got the Switch, and we're making it prints money, boy. It's like the Nintendo DS 2.0. So basically, yeah, console gaming can be wild sometimes, and I find it really fascinating because, I wasn't really exposed to it too much firsthand growing up. Vicariously, sure, YouTube existed for most of my life, so obviously I was aware of what was going on, but yeah, it's just really interesting observing these sort of things in retrospect, and, different consoles rise and fall, come and go, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, thanks for sticking around for another episode of Vivid Noise. I'll see you at the next one.